ask Carlos McCauley, our director, if he'd like to share any opening thoughts.
Well, thanks, Andrew, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. Just to echo Andrew's sentiments, our hope here is to help you and assist you in your thinking around your strategic efforts to support your schools and districts. And as Andrew stated, kind of the next step of after developing a theory of action is thinking about your logic model and really that lays the foundation for the rationale for your support. And so this is the second in a series of thinking about your statewide systems of support. How do you begin to prioritize? How do you begin to support your schools and districts and carry out your theory of action? So Renee will spend time with you this morning, this afternoon, hopefully assisting you in as you think about your theory of action and how to take the next step and how to bring people together around your theory of action. Again, this is the second in the series as we kicked off this series in October with this follow-up to theory of action and then moving toward how do you think about your support and so some of those strategies around your support. So again, thank you all for joining. I encourage you to use the chat. We want this to be an opportunity for you to engage in this conversation, not just with Lene, Andrew, myself, and or others on CST, but also with your colleagues across state. So thank you all again for taking the time out today.
Thank you, Carlos. I see we've got some additional people joining, taking advantage of that chat room to identify yourself and your role. That's very helpful to us to know who we're addressing because, after all, there are 4 of these communities of practice scheduled. This is the second one today, and they really indicate a natural progression, as Carlos said, toward building capacity. Today's webinar agenda you see on the screen. We're going to turn things over to Dr. Lene Dunn in a moment to talk about turning the theories of action you've been working on into logic models, discussing the individual elements of logic models, and there are several of them, then follow some real examples of theories of action into logic models. You'll see a few different versions and examples, and then have a chance to follow the progression from the theory of action into a logic model development. And then, of course, as Carlos talked about, we want to give you plenty of opportunity to interact as part of today's webinar. That's where the real learning occurs, with your questions, some of your challenges, some of the considerations that you have right now as you do this important work. So then the opportunity for a little peer reflection and feedback and discussion responding to your needs. And with that, I have the easiest job in the world. I get to turn things over to the expert, Dr. Lene Dunn, who's doing work pretty much week in, week out, traveling around the country discussing this kind of very formal, very disciplined approach to the important work of SEAs and regional comp centers in supporting LEAs and ultimately schools in supporting those struggling schools and addressing the challenges, addressing student impact. So, Lene, it's all yours.
Well, thank you, Andrew and Carlos. I'm happy to have all of you here and to build off of what we've done together previously. And you'll see I'm really going to take our theory of action, which we've had a lot of opportunity to talk about over the last couple of months, and, you know, as Andrew said, walk you through how to take that into a logic model. So this is just a reminder of how the theory of action links to the logic model. So if you recall, the theory of action starts with the strategies and then says the results that you're looking to achieve through those strategies. And that just links directly to a logic model with the strategies connecting to priorities, inputs, and outputs, and the results in your theory of action linking to outcomes, assumptions, and external factors. So when you see this connection, this might at first seem like, how do you make those things connect? But we're going to walk through each element of that to show you how they do. So we have an example theory of action. So this is based on an SEA's real theory of action with some additions to it. So it starts with if SEA this example SEA, supports districts to use a cycle of continuous improvement to turn around their lowest performing schools. Then is the result, districts will strengthen their district systems of support necessary to continuously improve district and school performance, and that's the other portion of the result that gets down to the student level. Student performance in the lowest performing schools will increase. So this is the theory of action we're going to really focus on and work with today. So I wanted to start to think about how do we break this into strategies and results. So let's look first at what are the strategies that are behind this theory of action. It's pretty clear that it has a particular focus. So what is that focus? Does anyone have any ideas of the strategies that are highlighted in this theory of action? You can type it into the chat, or feel free to talk and just see what do you see in terms of the strategies of this particular theory of action.
I would say the focus on continuous improvement.
Could you say that one more time, please?
I would say the focus on continuous improvement.
Absolutely, yeah. So they have embedded continuous improvement throughout this theory of action. So we can definitely tell that that is a strategy that they're looking to emphasize. That's great, thank you. What else do you see in terms of where the strategy is? You know, what level of the system is the SEA really looking to support?
The state agency is supporting the district that's going to, establish a system to support the schools to impact the student performance.
Yeah, thank you, Molly. That is exactly it. So it's very clear from the theory of action that districts are seen as that real, unit of change. So some of the strategies that you saw in this theory of improvement were, or theory of action was the SEA supporting districts in continuous improvement, that districts are really targeting their lowest performing schools because they're calling out the lowest performing schools in this theory of action, and districts strengthen their systems of support. So those are some of the strategies that are really focused in this theory of action. And then the results, if you look back at what the theory of action focuses on for results, it's continuous district and school improvement and increased student achievement. So they're seeing the district as the conduit or the facilitator of change to the school level, which then will impact student achievement. So those are the kinds of results that are focused on in this theory of action. Any questions on this theory of action? Because like I said, we're going to work through this theory of action through a full example. So I just want to make sure everyone feels comfortable with this theory of action and kind of what it's trying to pull apart in its strategies and its results. You can just give a thumbs up, or there's even the mood. You can see there's an emoticon with a smiley face. Just let me know that this sounds good to you, or put a green check mark. And if you don't, if there's any questions, you can put that red X. I see green. Good. Okay. So let's go ahead and move on to talk about a logic model. So I'm sure you've worked with different iterations of logic models, and there are so many different ways to put together a logic model. And I'm going to show you a few examples, and then I'm going to work you through the template that we at the Center on School Turnaround really use. But I do want to say this is just one model. There are many different models. So a logic model is really a visual representation of a program or approach and its desired outcome. It lays it out, typically on one page, but you can see the elements of a program and what that program hopes to achieve. It takes that theory of action and further pulls it apart to make it really clear what those strategies are of a program and what those desired results are with some level of specificity. it really takes those if-then relationships in the theory of action and lays it out in multiple ways, and it sets it up so that as you evaluate and monitor a program, you know exactly what you're looking for in that program. But my caveat is there are many different models, from really complicated ones to really simple ones. So I'm going to just show you a couple examples, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on any of these at this point because we're going to walk you through one example very specifically. But I want you to see just a few examples of what logic models can look like. So the first one is our very own Center on School turnaround logic model. We shared this with you back in August, so this is probably looking pretty familiar to you. This is the template that I'm going to walk you through today. It has the priorities or the impetus for the program, inputs, outputs, outcomes. So we're going to talk about the difference between those elements, assumptions, and external factors. So those things that are underlie the program. So we'll talk through each of those elements. But this is what we use as a Center on School turnaround to really focus our work.
And folks, if I can just jump in, if you think you've got any background noise at all, go ahead and hit mute. And of course, we'll give you plenty of time to unmute if you've got questions or thoughts that you want to interject. Thanks.
This next one is a very similar format in terms of the elements, and this is from a government, youth.gov, in partnership with the National Forum on Youth Violence Prevention. I wanted to include this for a couple reasons. I think one, you see that they use the situation along with the priorities. So for them, it was really important to give more context for why this program was put in place. And you'll notice their outputs have federal and local elements to it. So that was, kind of a unique take on it. But ultimately, it's got a very similar structure to the structure we're going to walk you through today. This next one is a little bit of a different logic model because some are more linear than others. This one, you see lots of arrows kind of moving to different places, arrows going back to other places, and it's more kind of a flow chart. It's got the same kinds of elements, inputs, outputs, outcomes. Those same basic elements are there, but it really kind of moves in more of a flow chart from they're really linking specific activities to specific outputs, and those specific outputs to specific outcomes. And the other model that you saw, those kind of linked more across each other. So this is just another example to think about. You can look at the source and see, there's lots of examples of that link there if you'd like to see other examples. This last one is really my favorite one because it was developed by kids. And I include this because I want to say that, at its base, a logic model really is logic. And it really does lay out what is the thinking behind a program. And the story behind this is that these Courtney and Bailey Peters were children of someone who went through a logic model workshop, and she came home and talked to her kids a little bit about what a logic model is, and they were going, they had this idea of creating a safer playground, and so they created a logic model to think about what they could do to raise funds to do that, to create that. So it's just a neat way to kind of show that, there's many different ways to do a logic model, but ultimately it's laying out your thinking behind a program. So I'm going to go back to our example theory of action so that we have that as a reminder as we start to pull this apart and work it into a logic model. So you'll remember it has the if, then, and. So if the SEA is working with districts on continuous improvement, and then districts are going to strengthen their systems of support to continuously improve, and then student performance in those lowest performing schools will increase. And then this is also just a reminder of how those elements kind of fit together. I'm going to break this down and first focus on what the strategies, how those directly link to the logic model, and then I'm going to talk about the results section. So looking at the strategies, remember on the theory of action, that's really the left-hand side. It's what, what the SEA, in our case, is going to do. So the strategies link to the priorities, the inputs, and the outputs. It's really the what are we doing and how are we going to do it. So let's look at first priorities. Priorities are really the question of why is this program or approach coming into place? What are the reasons for it? So as you think about your own state system of support and you've developed your theory of action, what was it that helped you define that program or that approach? Did you have a needs assessment? Did you have direction from your from state leadership? Did you have feedback from stakeholders? What was it that set the priority for your program? Was there something that you really wanted to be different? So it's nice for you to kind of stop and reflect and think about that for your own program. I'm going to show you with our example theory of action what the priorities might have been that led to that one. But just think about this for your own as we move forward. So in our example theory of action, we identified those strategies. It was district continuous improvement, districts targeting lowest performing schools, and districts strengthening their systems of support. So what might have been the priorities that led to that? Well, as Molly pointed out early on, continuous improvement was really clear in that theory of action. So a priority or a reason for this approach was the SEA's commitment to continuous improvement. This SEA is starting to embed continuous improvement in everything that they're doing. So they wanted to make sure that that was reflected in their theory of action. It also came from feedback from districts that they really wanted more support to strengthen their systems. As the SEA was providing, in the past, more direct support to schools, districts felt left out of that and wanted to be able to strengthen their own systems to better directly support the schools. And then this also came from a belief that the SEA is developing that to improve schools, they have to build LEA capacity. This SEA, has a small staff, as most SEAs. It's the reality. We have a small staff that we're trying to work with to directly support and improve districts and schools. And knowing that there's only a few key people to be able to go out and do that work, this SEA said we've got to build LEA capacity in order to ultimately improve schools. So those were the priorities to the program. So it's a conversation often to really set what those priorities were. And that's a good reminder that as you've been working on your theory of action, I know many of you have started to bring in stakeholders, get feedback from within your agency, across your agency, from other SEAs, from state leaders. Having all that stakeholder input really helps you better articulate the need and what your program is really trying to achieve. And that's well reflected here in the priority. So this would be a good place for you as you're building out your own logic model to capture some of what you've heard from stakeholder feedback about the priorities. Any questions about priorities before I move on to talk about inputs?
And Lene, while people are thinking about that, it just strikes me, going through this, what you're presenting right now to our participants who are at the SEA and RCC level, this is exactly analogous to the conversations they can lead and that they can use. And the questions that you're putting out across this webinar are the questions that can prompt that kind of conversation from SEA to LEA and even from LEA to individual schools. I mean, this is applicable all the way down the line The closer we get to students, the more important the conversations become. Fair enough?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So that you'll see as we go through each element of the logic model, I pose a few questions for you to reflect on. And, you know, Andrew, I think that's a great idea to sort of have those as internal conversations and then also, you know, lead those conversations with LEAs. So I'm going to move on to input. And remember, we're still on that, when we are linking the theory of action to the logic model, we're still on that strategy section. And the inputs really is thinking about what do we bring to the table in terms of resources. So what resources do we have for our program or our approach? What do we need in order to support the program? So some of you might be starting a program more from scratch or reworking a program. So it's not even necessarily what you have currently, it's what do you really need in order to support a program. Or even those of you who've been working with an existing team for a while, maybe you realize you need some other kinds of support in order for the program to really succeed. So this is the place to start to capture that. And really think about what is it that you need, what are those resources that you need in order to ultimately achieve the outcomes that you're looking to do. So in our example, I'm just repeating those same strategies: district continuous improvement, targeting low-performing schools, and strengthening their systems of support. So what inputs do they have? Well, there are 4 SEA staff dedicated to improving the lowest performing districts and schools. The SEA has expertise on continuous improvement methods. It's nice to record that kind of element as a resource. We don't often think about expertise as a resource. We think about money and staff, but expertise can be a really important input to capture and record and document.
Yeah, but somewhat challenging to quantify, maybe. So your point's well taken about figuring out some way to kind of record the depth of that expertise in some way.
And it also allows you to think about what expertise don't you have and where do you need to bolster some more of that. So really trying to capture that is nice to have. Other inputs, federal and state funding, you can get really specific in your logic model and say exactly how much funding you have if you want to, or what those sources are. It's really up to you how much specificity you have, but it's good to say, you know, we have a particular set of funding. And then also partnerships with their regional comprehensive centers. So this particular SEA, you know, was working closely with their RCC. So those are the inputs that they have. And that leads us then to outputs. And again, we're still working with this strategy section of the theory of action. This is where it becomes, what do you do, SEA? What are the activities that you do? And we're going to break outputs into 2 elements. We're going to have strategies and activities, and then we're going to have kind of how you quantify those. Outputs are different than outcomes, and we're going to talk about outcomes in a minute. But I like to think about outputs as just the doing part. So what does the program or approach do? What is your SEA doing? What do you offer districts and schools? It's a very tangible, you know, element that you can identify. So in our example, some strategies and activities that this SEA does is they offer workshops on continuous improvement approaches. Remember, that harkens back to their priorities, that harkens back to the inputs and the expertise that they have. They offer coaching on district systems of support because they're trying to build that district capacity. And they have supports on identifying and supporting the lowest performing schools. So helping districts really think about what are their processes to identify and support those schools. So those are some of the strategies and activities that they have. So when you first start to do this for your own work, it's nice to just start to list what those are. What are those kind of high-level activities that you do? The second part of that is then taking that and saying, what do we create as a result of those activities and strategies? This is where you start to really quantify what those are. and you can get very specific about what that looks like. So I'm going to show you how you take that higher level, like, oh, we offer workshops and we offer coaching, to something much more specific. So in our example, the SEA offers quarterly workshops on continuous improvement. So they're identifying exactly how much. Now, what's nice is once you articulate this in a logic model, you can start to really peel back the layer and say, is this enough? Is this the right amount? Right now, you're just documenting what it is, and then you can start to think about what you might want it to be. Another output is that they coach 20 districts annually, and they offer 5 sessions on identifying and supporting the lowest performing schools. So these are the quantifiable outputs of what the SEA does. And so often when we're reporting about our successes or what we've done in a year to our boards or others, we kind of stop here and we just say, well, this is all that we did, and look at all that we did, and we don't often move it forward into what did that actually achieve for us, because these kinds of outputs are easier to capture than some of those, less tangible results.
Well, educators are used to working in a concrete world. We tend to go toward what's tangible, what we see. Your point's well taken.
Yeah. But it's good to really, identify these and record these.
Folks, just a reminder to mute if you can, picking up a little background noise and conversation. Thanks very much.
So I'm going to be moving to the second part of the theory of action, which is the results section. So I'd like to pause here and just ask if there are questions about this strategy piece of the theory of action and how it links to the first few elements of the logic model.
Why would they have 5 sessions on identifying the lowest performing schools?
Say that one more time.
Annual.
Why would you call in the field, people from the field, to hear that?
I don't get that.
How many times are you going to go through the statistical analysis or whatever?
Yeah.
Hey, folks, I think we're picking up a side conversation. You may not be on mute, but you might think you are.
Although I'd love to hear if you'd like to share what you were thinking about there, because this is an example, and certainly, there are different approaches that they could take, and this is just kind of thinking through what an SEA might be offering related to this theory of action. You might take a different approach. So I'd love to hear if you had any questions or thoughts about those elements.
Yeah, especially as they apply to your particular situation. That's where this is meant to be most valuable, is in response to something specific that you're dealing with.
Okay, well, you might have some more thoughts or questions as we move forward, but I'm going to go ahead and move to the second part of the theory of action, which is the results section. So this is really, honestly, this is the harder part. As we mentioned, it's kind of easier to be concrete about here are the things that we're offering. It's a lot harder to say this is what we get out of what we offer. But we take our theory of action, the results that we identified in that theory of action, and we put it into outcomes, assumptions, and external factors. So I'm going to start with the outcomes piece. And there are many different components to outcomes. So there's direct and indirect. I'm going to start with direct because they're more concrete, and then we'll go to the kind of indirect piece. Direct outcomes are things that you can observe and measure that you can link back to the strategies that you provide. And there are different short, medium, and long term that I'll talk about in a minute, but I first just want to drive home that direct is something that you can make that direct connection back to your strategies. If you remember one of the logic models that had lots of arrows and kind of was like a flow, they did that in the logic model to really show, hey, this strategy, we expect directly this outcome from these particular strategies and outputs. Some logic models cut more across, but you can make that direct linkage is the idea. So we have short, medium, and long-term outcomes. Short-term outcomes are usually something that happens after what you might call like the intervention or the delivery of the strategy. So let's look, thinking about our example that we've been working through, they are offering some workshops, right? So short term, you can expect changes in knowledge or attitude. You can't really expect in the short term for people to do more than change and grow their own knowledge. But in the medium term, the knowledge that they've gained can change their behavior. And in the medium term, we often see changes in policies, procedures, systems. That's where you're really going to start to see some changes. So it could be an individual, but usually when we're thinking at the SEA and district level, you're going to see that manifest in policies and procedures and things like that. And then long term are changes in proficiency and skill. So that's going to be those broader, more systemic changes. So capacity building, full system development. At the individual level, that means that their proficiency in something, that means like their ability to do that in a long-term sustained way is what's changed. I'm going to pause here because I know that's a lot of different elements and different information. I'm going to show you the example in just a minute, but questions or thoughts about that in the short, medium, or long term and how you kind of think about those three components? And feel free to use the chat if you don't feel comfortable speaking. That's totally fine. And Carlos put out a great question. What are some examples of outcomes you began to discuss internally with your team? So as you have been thinking about your own approach, what are the kinds of outcomes that you're thinking about?
So I've got a question for you, Lene, and I know I'm sandbagging you because I'm right across the table from you, but you're describing a progression of changes, really. The short-term changes, the medium changes, which are behavioral and may lead to policy, and then the long-term changes. In your experience, is there one of these that represents kind of the heaviest lift for an SEA, where maybe the people attempting this on the ground see the biggest resistance, or it's the toughest to affect out in the field?
Well, I mean, I think that this is universal, that it's the long term is the hardest because it's just that more distal, and we're going to start to talk about indirect in just a minute, but as you move to long term, that's really those bigger, more systemic changes. It's easier to make those small piece changes that, you can improve people's knowledge, you can see changes in policy, but how those policy changes or those knowledge changes actually impact system change is much harder.
Yeah, you can laminate a new vision statement and put it on the wall of every classroom. That doesn't mean you're actually changing the behaviors of the school. The knowledge piece, the first part, fairly easy in comparison to at least present more knowledge.
Right.
But a lot of SEAs we work with sometimes feel like they're doing more pushing of people than pulling, perhaps. Any questions or responses before Lene goes on to present some specifics to this?
Well, looking back at our sample theory of action, so we had two elements of the results: continuous district and school improvement and increased student achievement. So breaking that down and saying, what does that really mean in terms of direct outcomes that the SEA can have a direct impact on? So in the short term, it would be increased LEA knowledge of continuous improvement processes and supports for low-performing schools. So that's what they're really starting with and thinking about in terms of short-term changes in that knowledge. The medium-term outcomes would be improving those LEA systems to support low-performing schools. So they have those policies and processes to support, and they've got more embedded procedures and policies to do that, which just ties into that longer term, which is that there's improved capacity to really embed continuous improvement into all district systems and supports. So the progression here is saying, okay, we have better knowledge of continuous improvement and how to support low-performing schools. We're starting to act differently in our policies and our processes to support those low-performing schools. And in that long term, it's the capacity to really embed it throughout, not just low-performing, but that continuous improvement piece is integrated throughout all of their district support systems. Indirect program outcomes. So these are the hardest to measure and sometimes to really identify. So you want them to be measurable and observable, but they are going to probably be indirectly from the strategies, meaning that you, SEA, can't necessarily directly impact what happens, but you can set the context up so that these other pieces fall into place. These are longer-term outcomes, and they're going to have broad goals that you're contributing to and really influenced by those outside factors that are beyond your control. So you can't control what happens at the district or at a school, but you can provide the context and you can contribute to that. So let's look at our example. So we have continuous district and school improvement and increased student achievement as the desired results. So the indirect outcomes is improved school capacity for continuous improvement. So if you remember back, we just looked at the direct outcomes, and that was improving LEA capacity for continuous improvement. But improving school capacity is indirect because you as the SEA don't have that direct link to the school. And the same with student achievement. Increased student achievement in the lowest performing schools. There's nothing about your strategies, your output, that are going to directly have an impact on student achievement, but because of the work that you're doing in this example, the work that they're doing at the LEA level, they'll be able to improve those systems and processes, which would lead to increased student achievement. So you have to be able to make that connection and be able to observe it, but it still is that indirect connection. So as you start to reflect on your own outcomes, and actually before we move to assumptions, I did want to just pause, and I'd love to hear from some of you the kinds of outcomes that you're trying to identify for your programs. Like, what are the kinds of, in your state system of support, that you've been thinking about as outcomes, and how do you see those fitting in this frame of short, medium, and long term?
So can somebody venture forth a response to that? We're looking for a brave, intrepid soul.
So just looking for any examples of outcomes that you've been working with and kind of thinking about how they might fit into this framework of short, medium, or long-term outcomes.
Hello?
Lene, this is Mary. one of the things that some of the states I'm working with always have on the forefront is closing the achievement gaps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what do folks think about where that might fit in terms of short, medium, long-term, direct, indirect?
So this is Mary again. I think it's an indirect long-term, but I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, that's exactly where I would put it. And of course, it all depends on what the activities and strategies are. You know, if there are some strategies that are specific to schools and closing the achievement gap, it might be direct, but I would say, yeah, in most examples, it's going to be the long-term indirect. And I'm seeing Julie Duffield is saying the same thing, long-term indirect. I agree. And that is a big one. And I think this is where, you know, we haven't yet talked about measuring that, and that's something we'll talk about later in this community of practice and thinking about long and short-term goals. But I think it is a nice exercise to really lay that out and start to say, what are those direct and the indirect, because you want to make sure to have a good mix of both. Because if you only have indirect, that's going to be really hard for you to show that what you're doing is making an impact. But if you have both direct and indirect, you can kind of show how you're building towards those indirect outcomes as well.
Well, and it's an analogous challenge, because the LEA has got to be able to show results to its own community. But the SEA is under pressure to show results also. I mean, there are all kinds of eyes, public, policy eyes, both at the state and the federal level, wanting to know what this impact looks like, which is why you have to have that balance that you're talking about. And I'm wondering if then, in your experience, or if anybody wants to comment on this, is it difficult sometimes for SEAs to get LEAs thinking about the long term? Or sometimes is there a disconnect there sometimes where LEAs are all about the short term and we have to do this, and it's difficult for SEAs to lead them into an awareness of the long term, or maybe even some of the indirects?
One of the things we've been working on is exactly what you just said, getting the LEAs to think about long-term and think about putting a structure in place to support schools, not just the 2 that are on the failing schools list right now or the 3 next year and worrying about what's going on right now, but having a solid structure of support in place. So we're definitely trying to move in that direction.
And that's great. Thank you so much for that, because, of course, we all understand that, you know, out in the field, a lot of the folks you're working to support are feeling like they're putting out the fires right in front of them. And, of course, there's a great deal of public attention on those low-performing schools. But what you're bringing up is that SEA level or RCC challenge to make this about capacity beyond the individual low-performing schools and create systems that are moving everything forward.
Right.
Thank you. That's important to note. By the way, she wins a free toaster for responding out loud. That'll be coming to you, UPS, in the next 48 hours. You see how easy it is? Any other thoughts on that?
So I do have another comment. Sorry.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Yeah, since no one else spoke up, I do have another comment. We started working on our theory of action, and we're kind of in transition because with leadership. But after listening to this WebEx, I'm thinking that we might need to go back and rethink, because our theory of action is focused on reorganizing the state agency to make sure we prioritize, we promote, and support leadership. but we're looking at the school level, making sure that all leaders at the school have the knowledge and skills basically to move the school forward, but we don't have a direct connection, or we don't have plans as of right now of going through the district and creating that structure at the district level to support the schools, even though we know we need to do that. So I'm thinking maybe we need to go back and rethink that, our theory of action.
Molly, that is such a great example to share about why, it's good to articulate that, and really as you start to put it into a logic model and show those direct and indirect and how it all lays out, you start to see those holes, right? And you start to say, well, how do the activities and strategies that we say we're going to do link to our outcomes, and where are the opportunities to make those changes? So it is such a great opportunity for that, and it really starting to pull out of each piece and say, what is this thing that we value, and what is this thing that we're trying to do? So that's a perfect example of that.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that a lot of other SEAs have been struggling with, that shift to work with the district, and what does that really mean to work with the district? Because ultimately, you want to affect what happens at the school. So how do you use the district as a broker and as, a partner in that? And I think that's something that many SEAs are kind of struggling with, and trying different ways of how you do that, knowing the importance. I mean, like you said, we know we need to do it. It's the how. And I think maybe as you start to go back to your theory of action, pull it apart and say, what are the strategies, what are the results, and then really start to link it and ask yourself the questions that are in here, you might start to, it might emerge what that approach could be.
Yeah.
All right, where are we going next?
Well, we're going to talk about some of the other elements of the logic model that, again, this is just in the kind of template that we're sharing with you. There are many different ways, but we really think it's important to talk about assumptions. So what are some assumptions underlying your approach? What needs to be in place in order for that approach to work? And what are you assuming about the system that you're trying to change? So this kind of, in some ways, when we talked about the priorities, sometimes that shows up in priorities and it links back to assumptions, but it's really like, what are you assuming is already there in order to make the changes you're trying to see? So in our example theory of action, continuous improvement was definitely woven throughout, and that district element was woven throughout. So there are really two assumptions there. One is that continuous improvement ensures long-term sustainability of effort. So that's an assumption that the SEA is making, that continuous improvement is that key to sustaining efforts. There's really, great research out there that supports that, and I would encourage you, as you start to identify what those assumptions are, to check and see, are those valid assumptions? Or are you making leaps that maybe aren't supported? And so this is a great place to turn to your RCC partners, to CST, to others, to find what are some of those supporting research that's out there to support these different assumptions. But a second assumption would be districts can facilitate and support change in schools. Again, well supported in the research. How you do it, of course, is the key. But an assumption here is that districts have a role in school change. So these two assumptions, what's great when you articulate them and put them on paper is that you can have that conversation. So when you have your one-pager that you can go and talk to districts or others within your SEA, it just gives you a talking point, and maybe you come up and you find, we have a different set of assumptions than you do in this other part of our SEA, and we need to have that conversation. I think someone was going to make a comment or ask a question. I thought I heard someone asking the question, but I think that's the real value is in some of the discussion that happens around the logic model and the theory of action, and really getting those assumptions on the table is a great place to start, because I think you might sometimes find there are other assumptions, and in pushing leaders in your agency or district leaders to help articulate what their assumptions are is a great way to kind of come to the same page. The other piece would be external factors. So things that are out of your control but could definitely impact the outcome of your program or approach. So there are a lot of these often, and especially in education, there are so many external factors, but we want to try to articulate a few of them. So in our example, some of those external factors might be district and school staff turnover. So, you know, for the most part out of our control, but definitely could impact the outcome. Federal policy. So there are shifts in federal policies. That could be funding sources. That could be how federal policy impacts the implementation of your state ESSA plan. Out of your control, but could definitely impact your outcomes. And also state legislative changes. So there might be legislative priorities that come up, or changes in funding, or different particular emphasis on other policies that might impact it. So again, the purpose of that is just getting it on paper to say, what are those? And how might those impact our program or our approach? And if they do, how could we pivot, and how can we work around that? So the point of it isn't that, you know, you'll be able to change them, but you'll be able to at least articulate what those are. So this is the culminating artifact from walking through this logic model. So we started with, at the top, the theory of action. So, you know, the one that we started with, if the SAE supports districts to use a cycle of continuous improvement to turn around their lowest performing schools, then districts strengthen the district systems of support necessary to continuously improve district and school performance, and student performance in the lowest performing schools will increase. So we took that and we broke it into all of these different elements. So now you can see it on one page. We've got the priorities on the left, our inputs, outputs, outcomes, assumptions, and external factors. And this can become that document that you start the conversations with each other on. Again, this is just one example of how that could really look, but hopefully it's a kind of a nice, clear articulation of how you take a theory of action, which is really just what it says, a theory, an approach, an idea of how you're going to do something, and breaks it down into specifics of what are the resources you have to do it, what kinds of activities and strategies are you doing, and what kinds of impacts are you looking to have at the short, medium, and long term. So I want to pause here, give you a minute to look at this, but also questions or thoughts of things maybe that, you know, we missed putting in this. You know, what are there elements that maybe could be better articulated or might be different in this example?
What are we missing, or what would you say differently?
Or even just, you know, just reflections or thoughts. Is it helpful to see this all on one page? We got a comment, thank you, Julie. Julie was just saying that, you know, every time she hears sharing this process, because Julie and I have worked on logic models together before, definitely. You know, she says it helps her address her own assumptions around the support work that she provides as a TA provider. So that's helpful. Even when it's not your own work, going through this process and thinking about it helps you think about and reflect on your work. So thank you, Julie.
More feedback, either out loud, if you want to venture it, or in the chat room.
So we had kind of wanted to just open up to some general Q&A, and we have one question that came through. So how often do you update a model? So that question is a great prompt to say that a logic model, and I don't think I said this in the session, so thank you, Julie, for that reminder. So a logic model is not static. It is a living document, and the idea is to come together and revisit the logic model at key points. And there's no right answer to how often that is. There are some things that might prompt you to go back to your logic model and revisit it. So maybe a change in priorities would prompt you to go back and look at it. A change in leadership or staffing, pretty significant changes like that. If you have elements of your program that you have, like you've been doing evaluation on and it's not working well, that's a great reason to go back and lay it back out and say, well, then where are our holes? What's missing in our process so that we can make it better? If I had to be pinned down to say an amount of time that should, you should make sure you're revisiting, I would say annually at least would be nice to look at and, do some updates to it. But, it might be more frequently than that if you have those particular prompts or changes that happen. That's a great question.
So you've been treated to a pretty substantial amount of information. You really want to give precedence to anything you have to say in the form of questions, reflections, and certainly issues that you're dealing with right on your desk, in your department, in your agency, or as part of your comp center role. That is the most important end goal we have, is to make this information immediately relevant to the work that you're doing. Consequently, if you've got comments, we want you to just barge right in. You also have the option of the chat room. And remember that we record all of this and we archive the chat room so that we can go back and review your input and respond to questions. So this is a time really for us to try to address any specific questions you have. Somebody jumping in or jumping out?
Came on.
We hope
Julie Corbett's jumping on.
Julie Corbett jumping on, all right. Great. Because the context of all of this, as we know, are ESSA plans and states identifying their CSI and TSI schools. Those low-performing schools are the ones with high achievement gaps. And in many states, those numbers are expected to grow. And we know that at the SCA level, there's a great deal of work to be intentional in your approach to supporting those schools. And that's what you're hearing and seeing in these first two communities of practice. First, a theory of action, and then the process of unpacking that into, as Lene talked about, calling out everything from the short, medium, and long-term outcomes to the assumptions. And, of course, we all know how easy it is to get LEAs to really surface their own assumptions about their ability to impact student learning. There are a lot of challenges involved in this work.
And Andrew, this is Carlos. If I can just add to what you just stated, this is really a great opportunity to take those high level items that you incorporated into your ESSA plans and really think about how to operationalize these things. How to take your theory of action and build out an approach that identify strategies that really support what you believe in. And that's what we hope that you all are, the types of conversations you all are having. And as Lene has provided here, I mean, these are the types of conversations that we are continuing to have. so that this becomes really, hopefully, a learning environment, and because you've created processes that allow you to have those cross-program conversations around strategies, around your theory of action, what you're learning from your work, your inputs, your outputs, where are gaps, where can we make shifts and changes, et cetera. And so here's the opportunity to really begin to think about how do you operationalize these ESSA plans for those that didn't do this on the front end. But how do you begin to operationalize this work, and what does it look like?
Exactly. And Carlos, building from that, the value that Lene talked about associated with moving from the theory of action to the logic model is that you unpack each element of a very systematic approach to really complicated work. We know the SEA challenges, or the challenges at the SEA level involved in doing this kind of complex work with LEAs that have very different capacity. You may have LEAs that are really well set up despite their struggling schools, that might have really good capacity to be responsive and walk with an SEA and RCC partnership through this work, and you may not because that capacity differs so much. So in a transition to getting your thoughts from across this network, you see some questions on your screen. Now, these questions are pretty deep, and some of them assume that you've been able to put some of this to the test. We'd love to hear about early successes, but there's a lot of learning if you want to share some challenges. We had some folks talk to us about the work they're involved in right now with LEAs. Another way to look at this is you've just been through a really careful, detailed unpacking of the logic model and how to assemble one. What resonates with you? Let's take it from a very basic element. What have you just heard that's going to stay with you when this webinar is over and prompt you to engage in some thinking of your own? What are you going to take with you out of this webinar? You want to share those thoughts? Another question, what's something, an understanding or a question that's formed in your mind as you've been listening and following along in the development of a logic model? That's a kind of a learning approach. A capacity question, who in your office, who in your department with whom you work would benefit from the information in this presentation? Who needs to see this so that your work at the SEA level or the RCC level can be more comprehensive or more cohesive going forward? Who are you aware of that needs to see this information? Because it's going to be available after this webinar, the slide deck, the transcript. So our intent here is to continue to build capacity through the rollout of this kind of sequential information. Love to hear your thoughts on that, either out loud or in the chat room. What are you going to take with you? And who are you going to go to talk about some of this? Phone lines are open. So I'm going to sandbag Mary Peterson. Mary, you talked about some of the work and the experience you've had. In what way does the logic model approach, as Lene has described it, connect to the work, for instance, you've been doing in Colorado How has it been helpful? What's it been like leading and working with an SEA to support LEAs with this kind of approach?
In the Colorado example, we've been working on talent for turnaround, and we really did start with a theory of action, and that morphed into a logic model. Maybe a better example would be the work I've done with New Mexico over the years in their Principles Pursuing Excellence. That whole effort began with the development of the logic model, not with all the elements that Lene described, but with many of the elements that she described. So before we even planned the first Principles Pursuing Excellence session, we sat down and spent a lot of time on developing the logic model. I guess we called it a theory of action, but it has the elements of the logic model as Lene described it. And now Principles Pursuing Excellence has been around now for 5 years, and so we are using this continuous improvement cycle, and hopefully we will be working with New Mexico to revisit that theory of action / logic model and revise and update it. So I have found it very important in my work. I guess I haven't always made the distinction between the theory of action and the logic model, but anything that I've been involved in that has had some success has always started with a deep discussion around the theory of action and the logic model.
Mary, thanks for that. And would you care to comment, you know, when you brought that approach for consideration, immediate acceptance, a little, any
there
kind
was
of
a little
resistance?
eye rolling. There was a little eye rolling because, you know,
sure.
SEAs are always under so much pressure to get things done. And so oftentimes they think that this is a time-consuming step that they can skip. But we go back to that logic model all the time, you know, to do the formative review. So are we really accomplishing what we said we were going to accomplish? So it's, yeah, there was I wouldn't say resistance, I would say eye rolling. But
yeah, understandable.
Yeah, because it is time consuming to do it thoughtfully. But
right.
A really important first step in my mind.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks for that. You just won a flat screen television, which will be delivered, just in time for Christmas. Makes a great gift.
Okay, thanks.
There's a comment, Lene, out of Alabama. There are a number of others within the state agency that support schools and districts. And this is really an issue of getting everybody on the same page as it relates to support. So there's some thinking out here, at least among our participants. Maybe there's some wheels turning right now about who else to involve in this kind of conversation. Just take them through this approach, as Mary said, to capture the kind of the stem of the thinking that then ties the work together and keeps it moving forward cohesively at the state level.
Yeah, and you know, one thing I've found that can be helpful, and I think Julie Duffield, you were mentioning that a theory of action in California is being used in some divisions and thinking about how to use it in others. I think one thing that's useful is if you do have something on paper, just a draft, and you approach it as a draft as you have those conversations, so in Alabama with others that are providing those services across your agency, because then there's something to react to. Because it's really hard to get 15 people in a room with a blank piece of paper and say, okay, what are we trying to do here? Right. Now, of course, you know, there are key times when that makes a lot of sense as you're forming your theory of action, and many of you probably have had some of those conversations where you did start with that blank piece of paper and say, what are we trying to do here? But especially as you move to a logic model where it's more specific and a little bit more, frankly, it's a little more complicated. It's nice to have a draft and sort of float that around and have some discussion questions. So hopefully you can take some of those questions that I embedded at each section and ask those questions to others within your agency, which actually reminds me, Andrew, you know, we've been talking about as a result of this series on the theory of action and the logic model, because this really concludes for this state system of support community of practice that section. You know, we want to have something that would be helpful to you all to continue this work. So I'm thinking that, you know, pulling together some of these questions and, you know, some of those elements that I presented here in the presentation into something for you to work within your own SEA. I don't know if that would be helpful to others that are on this call.
Well, on that note, because our time is winding down, there's a survey we'd like to invite you to take. Here on the screen you see some next steps, and to Lene's point, we absolutely want to capture and convert. We want to capture the information and the content from each community of practice, which, as we've said, will be available to you. But we also want to know, as you see there in the middle of that slide, the way to create follow-up out of resources that are going to create long-term value for all of you. If you have ideas, as Lene's just suggested, even capturing kind of the questions that drive the forming of the elements of a logic model, that might be something that we can put together. But if you have other ideas for resources coming off these communities of practice, that's really what we want to hear from you about. In addition to the survey and other ways of knowing how we're connecting with you. The next community of practice will be on specifically the SEA supports to the LEA work. So you can kind of see that cumulative learning happening from the first one, the theory of action. Today's topic, going from the theory of action to the logic model. And then the next one, the next community of practice sort of says, okay, so what then? What then are the strategies and the supports that SEAs can form in their work supporting LEAs? And we're always getting closer and closer to the students. The LEAs are supporting those schools. So again, any ability we have, any input you can give to the kinds of resources that would be valuable to you in addition to the contents of the webinar. Do look for the resources from today's webinar. They will be made available. We can follow up with all of you who registered for this. And right before we get to the survey, I'm wondering if Carlos wants to jump in with any closing thoughts or look ahead.
No, thanks, Andrew. I'm always just grateful for each of you to take the time out. We want to make these conversations as open to you and valuable to you as possible. I do want to thank Mary for her comments because I thought the example she used in New Mexico is a great example. Some X number of years later, the work that is happening in New Mexico is not only continuing, but it's expanding. And I like to think that it's in part due because of the work they put in on the front end and really thinking through what this could look like and what their theory of action and the inputs and outputs that support where they see that vision going. And I use that and reemphasize that example because I realize just how much pressure that each of you are under as leaders in your states and how much work is coming toward you. But part of this challenge with school improvement is the sustainability piece. And sustainability doesn't start at the end. It actually starts from the beginning. And so as much time that we can take out now to really think through this vision and think through the strategies that support the vision, it only helps to lay the foundation for sustainable work. So again, I just wanted to thank each of you for taking the time out as always to join us, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts, and I'll turn it back to Andrew just around the survey.
Thank you, Carlos. Yes, and on that note, we're going to open the survey now. We really hope that you'll complete that. We're nearing the time, the end of today's community of practice, but we have built in sufficient time. You see the survey then to the right over in the chat area. And this gives us valuable feedback because the whole idea is to not only create relevance to you over the entire program, but build on each community of practice. So your input is very important. So you've got a time lapse there that you see above the polling questions. Please go ahead and respond to those.
And these are used to help us plan for future events, and I know that Catlin Scott, our evaluator, was on the line, and she uses these as well in our evaluation. So we really do value your feedback, and I just wanted to thank all of you for bearing with me in trying to present a pretty complicated concept, and I look forward to your feedback, and I welcome your questions. So as you're starting to work through this, and you come upon a stumbling block, you know, we're really here to help. And you might have seen it or heard it in my voice that I do like talking about logic models and theories of action. So I do welcome your questions or thoughts as you continue to work on this. So thank you all for being here today.
And what better therapy for Lene Dunn's fascination with logic models than to engage with people actually doing the work. So please, direct questions, thoughts, challenges that you run into to Lene or to Carlos or to me at the Center on School Turnaround. We know the work you're doing is important, and we know you face pressures from a lot of different directions in doing it. That survey will stay up for a few more minutes. We hope you'll respond and look for additional communications regarding future COPs. And like we said, the resources will be available from today's webinar as well. And with that, that brings us to a close of the content, and we'll just leave that survey open. It'll be open for a couple more minutes for you to respond to. Thank you very, very much for participating today. Thanks to all of you who jumped in. We appreciate it.